happened? Let's fast forward in time for a second if we could. Let's pretend now that he's lived with the acrobats for a year. And I'm going to tell you something that may shock you. He stunk at being an acrobat. I know. You would think with all this fire in his soul and all these things that he's discovered about himself, you would think he'd immediately put his hands on a trapeze and he'd fly through the air with the greatest of ease, right? But you know what? He'd spent 17 years learning how to farm. He'd spent 17 years training in the ways of the earth. He'd spent 17 years under the weight of gravity. And those 17 years shaped his thinking, and they shaped his perception. They shaped how he saw himself. If you'll remember, one of those particular days shaped even the sinews of his ankle. How can someone who limps be an acrobat? And so he steps into this new life, and a year into it, it's not all it's really cracked up to be. He's starting to think that maybe he's not an acrobat after all. I mean, look at these kids. They're all acrobats, and they know how to do this stuff. He falls, he skins his knees. He doesn't know how to be like these kids that he's supposed to be like. He sees his parents come to practice and do things, and he's like, I don't think that's me. Now, there's a process that begins to happen over time. See, a year into it, he's thinking, what have I done? In fact, he may even be thinking something like this. Maybe I'm a farmer after all. Maybe I should just go back to the farm, to what I know, to what's familiar to me, and maybe I should just plow and plant. But his dad keeps saying things to him that drive him bonkers. He says things like this: son, it's time to go to practice. He says things like this: son, I love you. And when you fall, you just need to get up and try again. And again, the father looks him in the eyes and keeps saying those things to him. But here's what happens. The other kids are not so kind. The kids he goes to, the kids his age, and some of the older and younger ones, see, think about this for a moment. They've lived their life with this legend, this great acrobat who was lost at birth. And he shows up again and he can't even swing on a trapeze. And they're starting to resent the fact that they've grown up in the shadow of this legend, and so they kind of make it hard on him. They start kind of comparing notes and saying things to each other like, who does he think he is? And, being critical and harsh and mean. Even in the middle of practice sometimes, some would even shove him because they wanted to see him fail. And he'd leave the practice tent sometimes just in tears and going, I want to just go back to the farm. But see, the father kept looking him in the eyes. And the father kept talking to him, and the father kept his arms open to him. And so things would happen. Let me describe a couple of the things that would happen to him. He discovered a great place to hide. His favorite place to hide was, there was one particular wagon in the wagon train that belonged to the troop historian. This guy kept records. Long, detailed, historical records of the entire troop, where they came from, where they've been. He kept all the lineage of the different families. He kept records. Well, this young man found that if he could just kind of sneak off to the tent and just kind of read the stories, he could escape from what was out there. So he's reading. He's discovering things like what country they came from, and the name of the king that gave them their commission. He's discovering all these things about the troop, and he's enjoying the fact that he's not out there with the others because it's too painful and he feels too much shame to be out there. So he just goes and reads the stories. The other thing that happens is his mom notices the limp. And see, when you're a world-class acrobat and there's no such thing as cortisone and whatever else, they develop strategies for manipulating muscle and tendon and sinew to try to bring life back to things that have been damaged. And she says to him one day, she says, "You know what, son? I can really help you with that." He says, "What do you mean?" She says, that ankle, I can help you with that." And he says, "Well, what do you mean?" She says, "Well, here, put it up here." So he puts it up on the table, and she begins to push it in a way that really, really hurts. And he, ow, ow, that hurts. She says, "Well, I know, it's going to hurt because it's not the way it's designed. So to get it back to where it was designed, I might have to put you through some pain." So he puts the ankle back up on the table, and she pushes, and he's gritting his teeth, and he's just waiting. And she finally stops and says, "Well, there, that's enough." And he's like, and as he puts his foot down, he realizes it's got a little more flex to it. And as the day goes on, the inflammation goes down, he finds that his limp is significantly less pronounced. And she says, "Let's do it again next week." He's like, what? But sure enough, he comes back next week, and he puts his foot up on the table, and she starts manipulating that ankle and twisting it and pushing it. He's gritting his teeth and biting his hand. But after all the pain, he puts his foot down on the floor again, and week after week after week, what had been a significantly pronounced and actually crippling limp disappears completely. It seems like a good thing, doesn't it? It is. But here's the problem. He'd had many, 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 many years of thinking of himself as one who limps. You know what happens when you show up to practice and you're no longer one who limps? You may actually have to produce. So he gets to practice, and in his mind, he can no longer say to himself, "Yeah, but I got this limp," because he doesn't. And he discovers that more than the physical limitation was the limitation that came from seeing himself as a limping person. See, she fixed his ankle, but he had to begin to see himself in a whole new way before it could really benefit him in the practice room. So the kids are still making fun of him, and he's still struggling with this, and he'll run off to the historian's room, and he'll start reading the stories, and it just kind of brings him some peace to stay out and just read the stories. Till one day, he hits a point in the story where he sees this woman, his mother, conceives a child. And he looks again, and he stops, and he looks again, and he realizes the child she's conceived is him. See, the stories were a great escape for him until he began to see himself in the story. And he reads not only about her conception, but about the troops' hope for him and how greatly they were excited and how much they looked forward to his birth. People that he still sees in the troop are described in there as bringing gifts and speaking blessings over his life before he ever knew he had a life. And the more he read, instead of being able to escape, the more it drew him into the fact that this story included him. Now, instead of being an escape, it was pulling him into a reality that he still wasn't quite sure he belonged in, but he was beginning to believe. The hardest part was those stinking kids. It would have worked if it wasn't for those meddling kids. Sorry, random Scooby-Doo reference, right? The hardest part were the voices. He'd show up at practice, he'd even sometimes walking to the different classes, he'd hear kids make snide remarks behind him or next to him. Some of them would boldly look him right in the face and say wicked, terrible things about him. And sometimes those voices were even there when the kids weren't around because they echoed in his mind. And so he would run, days that he'd just run from the practice tent, full of embarrassment and shame, and just looking at himself, "Oh, what am I doing?" And one day, he ran away. He'd fallen a third time, and the kids were just merciless in the things they were saying and the ways that they were just treating him like he was nobody. So he runs off. Now remember, Dad kept telling him, "Go to practice, go to practice, go to practice." So he can't really go back home when he runs away from practice. So he had this habit of just planting himself outside the window of the house, sitting on the ground, waiting till practice was over, and then going inside. So he sits down, but today the window was open, and he heard his mom and dad inside the kitchen. And here's what they're saying. We're so glad to have him home. If he never gets on the high wire, if he never learns to swing on the trapeze, if he never steps into those things, our hearts have been restored because our son has come home. The one who's lost has been found. And our family's complete again. And he's listening. And you ever hear something that doesn't jibe with what is in your heart and you want it to? He's hearing this, and in his heart, part of him's pushing against it, what he's hearing, and part of him is reaching out, wanting it to be true. And they keep going. It's almost like they're kind of mushy about this thing. They just keep talking about how glad and how beautiful it is to have their son at home and how much they love. They're just talking together. He's not even in the room. And finally, he can't stand it anymore. He jumps up and he runs into the house and he grabs his dad by the collar and he says, "How can this be? How can you be happy with me when I can't even swing, I can't even jump? How is it that you can love me when I can't do any of the things that the other kids do and I certainly can't do what you think I'm capable of?" And the father looks at him again, looks him straight in the eyes, and he says to him, "Son, I love you because you're my son. What you do has nothing to do with who I am. I'm your dad, and I love you." And the son looks at him and says, "But you're constantly telling me, go to practice, go to practice, go to practice, go to practice. Why do you keep sending me to practice if it doesn't matter to you?" And it dawns on the father. He realizes the struggle inside of his son's heart, and he looks at him and says, "Son, I don't want you to do that for me. I don't need you to get good at that stuff to make me happy. Here's what you need to know. There are some things hidden in your heart that you may never discover if you don't push yourself enough to find it. I send you to practice so you can find who you are, not so you can make me happy." Son, just the room starts to kind of get woozy around him, and he's just still trying to fit it all into his heart. And he looks again at his father's eyes, and he looks at his face. It's like he's got a question, but something, instead of asking his question, he sees in his father's eyes something he has not seen until this moment. He sees himself. He sees his cheekbones. He sees his eyes. He sees the shape of his jaw in his father's face. And as he gazes into his father's face, almost like a mirror, he begins to see a reflection of who he is as he sees his own father. And it all begins to kind of hit in this deep place in his heart, so much so that he gets up and he leaves the room and he walks out and he starts wandering around the compound. His whole way of thinking just has him almost dizzy. And as he stops, he finds himself right at the practice tent. Kids have all gone home, no one in there, and he looks in and he feels something explode in his chest. When he sees the high wire, when he sees the trapeze, when he sees those things in there, the feeling that he used to have all the time begins to raise up inside of his chest, and he looks around and there's no one else, and he slips inside the tent and closes the door. Starts to climb up the ladder and puts his hand on the trapeze and he begins to play. Just to have fun. He's not working, he's not striving, he's just turning loose what's in him. And instead of working to learn what he should know, he's starting to become who he is. Let's fast forward again. Now we're 3 months down the road. They've moved again to another location. The tent's on the far side of town. And at this moment that I want you to see, The entire tent is filled. And people are looking up at the top of the tent. And what they see at the top of the tent is they see a young man standing with a blindfold on. One hand in the air, and he's listening. And a trapeze swings empty back and forth through the air. And as he listens, he hears just the right moment. He leaps up into the air and with one hand grabs the trapeze, spins around, grabs it with the other hand, does a triple flip, and swings over to the other side of the tent. And the whole tent just erupts. Even his parents are looking at him going, what the? Amazing. And their jaws begin to drop. And what happens is all around the tent, people's hearts are exploding. People are watching, and what they're seeing it's not a tent full of acrobats that were lost and found by farmers. It's a tent full of people whose hearts have long since gone to sleep. And they're seeing somebody who's stepping into exactly who they were made to be. And they watch, and the more they see the look on his face and they see the fullness of what it is he's capable of doing, putting gravity under him instead of over him, the more they see that, they remember. And a bunch of them go home and tie ropes to trees and just start to swing. Some of them stink at it, but a process begins. But you know, some of them go home and they go back to the music lessons that used to bring so much life to them. Some of them go home and they begin to work on the things that they used to do back when their dreams were still alive. Because what they saw that day wasn't something that they needed to become. What they saw that day was someone who was becoming himself. Let's pray together. Jesus, thank you that you've come back to the earth. Because had you not come back, we would have stood no chance. But because you came back and invited us back into the family, you've allowed us to become exactly who you created us to be. But Jesus, many of us have stuck our foot in a hole in the ground and twisted our ankles. Many of us have faced circumstances, whether growing up or in our environment, that bombard us with the fallenness of the world we live in. Sometimes even before we were born, the fallenness of the world falls on top of us and puts us underneath its dominion. Jesus, most of us have a hard time seeing ourselves in the story that you've written. But in this place right now, would you begin to show us, each one of us, who you've made us to be? In this place right now, Lord, would you show us that time in our life when we were so badly broken and we began to walk with a limp? Where were you? And what lies did we believe in those moments of our life?